Why do we sentence people to jail for different lengths of time? And what does the public think about the adequacy of sentencing? Well, sentencing serves multiple purposes: protection, rehabilitation, accountability, and so on. The judge takes into account the facts established by the jury when sentencing, as well as a range of other factors. These include the offender's history and prospects for rehabilitation, character evidence, any remorse, the defendant's mental state, the nature of the crime and the maximum penalty possible, any sentencing precedents, and whether the punishment fits the crime. The judge also takes into account any aggravating or mitigating factors and the relevant sentencing guidelines. Now, the overriding principle is that the sentence must be consistent with the jury's verdict. What does the public think about the adequacy of sentencing? According to research by Howe and colleagues in 1988, the public generally think that harsher sentences are actually required. Other research by Indermaur in 1987 agrees with this and showed that people think that the sentences handed down by judges are not severe enough. Indermaur reported an interesting effect, however. The less information that participants were given about the offence, the more severe they thought the sentence should be. This is possibly the result of relying on stereotypes about typical offences or recalling the most common offences reported in the media. As it turns out, Roberts and colleagues showed that most people have a very inaccurate perception of the actual severity of the sentences imposed by the courts, and that people assume that judges are very lenient. However, research by Starlins and Diamond in 1990 shows that when people are given input in determining the sentences, the public actually award lighter sentences than judges for the same types of crime. So, what factors might influence the public's confidence in sentences? Or perhaps stated another way, why is it that the public's perception of the adequacy of sentencing is actually very different from the reality of sentencing? Well, the first factor that might influence the public's perception is selective media exposure. Roberts and colleagues' 2002 research shows us that the media over-reports violent crime, especially on television. This affects the extent to which people estimate the threat from violent crime poses to society through what is known as the availability heuristic. This is when we estimate the likelihood that something will happen based on how easily we can think of examples of that thing. Now, because the media reports of violent crime are relatively easy to remember, we think that violent crime is a relatively common occurrence. In essence, people overestimate the degree of threat posed by violent crime, and so they estimate that more severe sentences are required to reduce this threat. The second factor that might be at play is a lack of information about the factors that are taken into account when sentencing. Research by Doob and Roberts in 1984 found that people who read media accounts of sentencing are less satisfied with sentencing practice. This is because the media doesn't typically report all of the factors taken into account by the judge in making a sentencing decision. Starlins and Diamond's 1990 research that we mentioned earlier found that when people had access to all of the information that judges have when sentencing, were actually more lenient than judges. And so judges were actually giving harsher sentences than participants would have given. So as for verdicts, the question is really to ask whether sentences are reasonable given the competing goals they're trying to satisfy. Whether prison sentences are effective, however, at meeting these goals is the subject of another whole series of lectures.